Okay, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's live webinar entitled Learning What You Know, Practical Applications of AI in Pharmaceutical R&D. My name is Kevin Miller. I'm going to host, but turn this over to our speaker in just a moment. Before I do that, we go to the next slide, Sean. I just want to take a moment and tell you a little bit about who Astrix is before we jump into today's content. If you've never been on an Astrix webinar before, I'd like to welcome you. If you've been on them before, we'd like to welcome you back. Astrix, who we are, we're a consulting firm that does work predominantly in the R&D space. We can go back to the last slide real quick, Sean, and then I'll just give you a nudge there. And a couple of things about the company. We were founded in 1995. We say we're vendor and platform agnostic. What that means is we work with lots of different technology vendors in the space, like our friends from Certara here, but we're not aligned with any one or the other, et cetera. We don't get into that world. We work with our customers to try to pick the best solutions based on what we know about them. So that's what we mean when we say that. Locations in the US and overseas, over 1,200 employees, and we're very proud of the fact that over 90% of those employees have advanced science degrees. We're very much a science-based company who are serving science-based customers such as startups, Fortune 1000, life science enterprises, chemical CPG, government agencies, and research institutions are all companies that we work with on a fairly regular basis. We go to the next slide, please. And then in terms of the overall solutions that we bring or the service offerings that we have within our catalog, we like to say that we accelerate digital transformation and optimize performance across your entire ecosystem. What does that mean? Well, we work with customers in the very beginning, oftentimes when we're dealing with things like strategic innovation projects or enterprise architecture projects. That's where we're trying to help companies figure out where they want to go from a technology standpoint, even if it's something as wrap our head around like cloud migrations and things along those lines, but helping them understand what kind of an architecture, what kind of people and business processes they need to have in place to execute on that is important. Then we get into solution selection, development, implementation of these systems. When we're finished with that, we can get into computer systems validation and obviously make sure that these systems are meeting the stringent requirements of the FDA. From there, we can provide a variety of different types of ongoing application support, on-site, off-site, onshore, nearshore, et cetera. There's a wide variety of choices there. And then we can staff not only your IT to help support these applications, we can even staff your laboratory. We have an entire staffing group of Astrix. So that's a little bit about who we are as a company, and we encourage you to learn more about us if you're interested in those services. But from here on out, I'd like to turn it over to our speaker. I'm going to introduce Sean McGee. He's a director of product at Certara, and basically working with their artificial intelligence division, right, Certara AI. And throughout his career, he supported the strategy and go-to-market motions of various software technologies, everything from Benchling's laboratory informatics platform and the AI molecular modeling and simulation offerings for Dassault systems. So with that, I'm going to sit back and enjoy the presentation with the rest of you all. Sean, the floor is yours. I'll come back on at the end to handle some questions.
All right, sounds great. And thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very excited to be here today. As mentioned, my name is Sean McGee. I'm the Director of Product working with Certara AI. And I'm very excited today to have the opportunity to sit down and talk with you guys about the different ways that we can apply artificial intelligence throughout the pharmaceutical R&D lifecycle, particularly in the discovery space. Just a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. First, just looking at how data impacts decision-making within the R&D lifecycle and some of the challenges and market pressures addressing the need to make some changes there. Then we'll talk about AI, what I mean when I say that, and why now is a particularly good opportunity to make these changes within your organization. And then we'll go into some use cases and areas where I see the actual usage of artificial intelligence being particularly useful in being able to drive some of these processes that we've discussed forward. So R&D productivity, that's been a challenge, a strategic initiative, whatever you want to call it. It is a major consideration for any biopharmaceutical or biotech, life sciences organization, and has been for basically the entire time the industry has been around. That idea of finding a candidate drug or and now even with new modalities, that it means that there is a large space of potential solutions to be able to solve, or in this case, cure diseases, right? And so because we have to start in this very open-ended, nebulous design space and narrow that down, it often means that it's hard to find efficiencies or efficiency improvements in that space. But the challenge is real, because as we move into the clinical trial phase and beyond, each step is not only a more important decision, but it's also a very costly decision. So anything that we can do earlier in this pipeline obviously is going to help us when we move further down and actually get things into the market. So it's always been a major consideration, and I think will always be a major consideration for the life sciences industry. And there's a lot of reasons why we need to do that. As I mentioned before, the regulatory landscape is tightening. There's always a stronger need to be able to demonstrate both safety as well as efficacy of any new drug entity that's moving forward into the market. And the costs to be able to demonstrate that are only getting larger. And so anything that we can do, again, to minimize those costs earlier on can help maybe cover some of those spaces further down the line. Additionally, there is always a need for speed. The 20-year patent cliff that exists for any patent, irrespective of pharmaceuticals, means that there is a ticking clock, right? Every day literally matters, and being able to move a drug from an idea to something that is going to be used to help a patient out. And the other thing, as I mentioned before, is that there are new approaches, there's new modalities, right? Like 10 years ago, bispecific antibodies were a huge thing, and now we're talking about being able to do CAR T therapeutics, gene therapies, a whole host of new ways and tools that we can use to address this. I'll primarily be focusing on small molecule therapeutics today, but these same ideas can be applied in these spaces because, again, there is so many new things, so many new innovations that are being brought into the space that it means that there is all kinds of new opportunities to be able to, again, improve that overall productivity. And so when we think about this, anything involving science often comes back to that idea of data, right? Being able to provide information to a scientist. I'm from California and currently broadcasting from San Diego, so I obviously have to put in my obligatory surfing analogy, but it's particularly important in this case, right? It's not just about connecting data silos together. It's not just about being able to make data more findable and accessible. Those are both very important considerations on their own. But it's also about being able for scientists to be able to access and utilize the right information that they need to inform that decision at that given moment in time. Just giving them more isn't the right way to go about it. And it gets doubled by the fact that there's always new data coming in. So to make sure that they don't wipe out, we really need to make sure that, again, we're providing the right information. It's not just about more. But at the same time, there's also gaps in data. It could just be the fact that that particular compound hasn't gone through a particular assay yet, but because there is a need for speed, decisions are often made without that complete picture. So it's a balancing act that we have to think about here. It's not just about giving people more data or making sure that they have the right data. It's being able to make sure that they have the data that they need at any given point in time so they can make that most informed decision at each step of the process. And so when we think about this, particularly recently, AI is a common thing that comes up. And I've been working in this space for a few years now, and the first question that we always get is, so what? What's the big deal? Why does AI actually matter? Most of the time, even what is it? How does this actually impact what we're talking about? And I think the last year, more specifically, maybe about like 10 months, has led to an explosion of the usage and applications of AI in the mainstream, right? You've got ChatGPT, you've got AIs generating art. If you're feeling particularly nostalgic, I think somebody was able to get ChatGPT to generate Windows 95 product keys. So if you've got a desktop that's been sitting in the back of your garage for the last 20 years, you could go and boot it up if you're feeling nostalgic. But the crazy thing about all of this stuff is that we're in a space of being able to ask what's possible, right? This explosion of AI and its general acceptance in the mainstream means that we do have a unique opportunity to be able to try applying this within the broader life sciences space. But when we talk about AI, it's not necessarily something that's new, right? The fundamental ideas and approaches are about as old as computers are themselves, going back in some instances to the 1950s. It's just the fact that the technology, the applications, the actual models themselves have led to a perfect storm in a sense, which I'll get into more detail in a couple slides. But I think it's important before we dive too deeply into talking about AI, without taking a moment to step back and basically set the stage. And because the ideas of AI, machine learning, deep learning, all of those things are often used interchangeably, but there are very subtle differences that I think is important to call out if we're going to have a deep discussion about this today. So first of all, artificial intelligence is a computer system that performs a task. It has a specific job it needs to accomplish, and that job normally requires an element of human intelligence. So this could be something like, in the case of being able to find a picture of a cat on a sidewalk versus just ordering a list. Any of those things could require an element of human intelligence and could qualify as artificial intelligence. Machine learning is a computer system that adapts automatically from experience without requiring explicit programming. We provide this computer program data. It then draws inferences from that data, basically learns patterns, and then we can use that to accomplish an artificial intelligence task. And then deep learning is a subset of machine learning that utilizes a very specific type of software architecture called a neural network to accomplish a specific task. So then to summarize again, so we have a set of tasks, something that may be a job that would require human intelligence. And again, this can be something incredibly complex, or it can be something very, very mundane. We can technically accomplish AI by utilizing a collection of rules, a bunch of if-then statements, right? So generic, I call it boring stuff. Depending on the use case, it can be the way to go. But in many instances, it's not necessarily something we would call machine learning. Explicit programming would actually accomplish that. Additionally, we have tasks that can be accomplished by machine learning, areas that don't require deep learning. And there's all types of approaches here: support vector machines, random forest models, things that do accomplish AI and do actually learn and adapt from data, but don't actually utilize a neural network to accomplish that task. And then there are subsets where deep learning would be the best way. And so again, artificial intelligence is not necessarily about having to utilize the coolest and fastest model. It's that we have a task that needs to be done. And then based off of that task and the requirements associated with it, we then choose the mechanism by which we achieve that artificial intelligence. And again, that can be just generic heuristics and coding. We can use machine learning for that, or we can also use deep learning. And the most important thing, of course, is that this is not Skynet. We're going to need to do a lot more work before we even get close to trying to do that, but I'll leave that for the future. But as I mentioned before, where we're at right now is that we're in a perfect storm for AI technologies. We utilize, for example, the first thing here is what we'd call it, I personally call it data fabric architecture, but really the interconnectivity of data is really the key here. Being able to take pieces of information from relatively disparate sources and being able to compare them or combine them, blend them, do different things to them, the general accessibility of data, and the overall drive to make data cleaner, adhere to bare data practices, makes all of these things that we're talking about today much more approachable. Additionally, being able to utilize GPUs to do these calculations means that many types of architectures and approaches which were previously too computationally intense to do are now fairly easy to take on. As I mentioned before, deep learning is a big driver for making this possible, and we'll get into that in the next slide, why. But it is a very, very powerful tool that allows us to do a lot more than we would have been able to in the past. And then all of this unlocks the ability for us to take on more complex and much more valuable use cases. And so as a result, all of these things together mean that we have a really unique opportunity to be able to utilize AI in the space that we're working with today. And so when I mentioned before, deep learning is a very, very large step forward in how AI can be accomplished. So traditional machine learning, and again, this is things that we would call like support vector machines, random forest models, non-deep learning approaches require a specific step called feature engineering. That is where a human comes in, looks at the data, and basically determines what are the meaningful trends or patterns in the data that can then be used to define the output. So basically, we could say, all right, if we're making a cake, what actually impacts the sponginess of the cake? Is it the amount of flour? Is it the amount of sugar? Is it the amount of eggs? Being able to identify what those meaningful trends are then allows the model to be able to make a prediction. However, deep learning kind of flips that idea on its head. It actually takes the data that's being presented to it and begins to learn what those patterns are on its own, irrespective of any type of human interaction. And this actually is a really, really, really important factor for certain types of use cases, such as image analytics. So in this particular case, our job is to determine if this is a picture of a Chihuahua or if it's a blueberry muffin. Now, for us, it's pretty easy, right? We recognize the patterns that make up a dog's nose, its eyes, its ears, the general shape of a Chihuahua's head versus a blueberry muffin. But if we were to do this utilizing traditional machine learning techniques, non-deep learning techniques, I would say, is we'd have to then sit down and tell a computer, okay, what collection of shapes makes an eye? What collection of shapes makes a nose? How do those shapes interact with each other to make a face? And then not only that, we then have to address the instances of what if the dog's looking to the left? What if it's a picture of a small cat? What if it is a chocolate chip croissant? All of these particular edge cases means that having to account for all of that in the way that we would handle this traditionally meant that you could do it, but it was really, really difficult. Because deep learning recognizes these patterns on their own, we don't have to account for all these edge cases. We just need to provide it the data. And so this allows us to take on, at least in the context of life sciences, fairly challenging problems. So AlphaFold is a fairly well-known approach to trying to predict the actual structure of a protein from just its sequence. And irrespective of whether or not you think that this is something that really works well or if it requires more refinement, the very fact that we can consider and attempt to do this type of work utilizing artificial intelligence is really, I think, a major step forward in demonstrating the applicability of these technologies within the life science space. And so when we start thinking about this and applying this, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today involves large language models, for example. When we start trying to apply AI within an organization, irrespective of whether it's in discovery, preclinical, clinical, regulatory, anywhere in the life cycle, really, we have to get back to the fundamental idea of what the AI is actually being asked to do. What is its job? Because any AI functions as a tool. So in this particular instance, we're looking at text-based analytics, right? This is not an exhaustive list, but this allows us to start thinking about it and how a human or a human intelligence would actually be required to do something like that. So for example, in the case of summarization, if I were to give a model a paragraph, it needs to first read the paragraph, understand what that paragraph's about, then find what are the most important points within that paragraph, and then rearrange those points into a concise statement, or maybe a collection of bullets, depending on what we want it to do. That's the job that we're asking the model to do. And so at the end of the day, the job should be the job, and then we see if AI can actually do it. So that's why in many of these use cases that we'll be talking about in just a moment, where we really get into it is being able to see what are the actual things that it's actually being asked or tasked to do. And I challenge you to think about that as we move through these particular examples, because at the end of the day, if you're thinking about trying to apply or bring in AI into your organization, you need to start here. You need to be able to ask yourself, what are the meaningful jobs we'd like it to do? And then see if AI is something that would actually be able to accomplish those things. But what's particularly useful is that many of these models are getting very, 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 very powerful. This is about a year old, some of this data, and already some of the models that have come out in the last 2-3 months are orders of magnitude faster, stronger, bigger than what we're seeing here, particularly when it comes to performance. And where we're seeing this in particular is that in many instances, particularly in text-based analytics, we're actually performing better than human baseline performance in many instances, which is particularly powerful when we're talking about dealing with unstructured text, because previously computers had traditionally struggled to do a lot with that type of data. And so when we think about this, and these challenges are specific to GPTs, but there are elements of this that would apply to almost any AI situation here. But there are some drawbacks to irresponsibly utilizing AI, particularly when it comes to GPTs in the sciences. First things first is that they're prone to hallucinating, which is a very, very fancy and polite way of saying that when a GPT does not know the answer to your question, it just makes something up. GPTs have been trained on a large variety of web-based data, and so they often know what the answer should look like, but not necessarily specifically what your answer is. So it's good at making something that looks right, but may not have the information that you need. Additionally, when we're talking about data in the life sciences, most of the training data and the information that these models have had access to ends in 2021. So if we want to utilize this to ask questions about literature, for example, or new developments, if it's come out after 2021, those models don't have access to that information. And so as a result, utilizing a publicly available GPT tool may mean that there is a gap in the information that it has access to. Additionally, there's not much referencing that's done within many GPTs. It'll provide you the information, but then it struggles to find or be able to tell you where it found that, which, you know, for a scientific organization is kind of a fundamental need to be able to make any kind of claim, irrespective of whether or not it's in a regulated space or not. And the last thing, which I think is particularly important here, is that the data that goes into a publicly available GPT model, it's gone. You lose any type of provenance over that data once it goes into that. And so many of these, many organizations have seen these kind of almost as a black box. And in some instances, that's also opened some organizations up to particular IP risk, because once it's in those models, it might show up in another individual's answer who may not actually be inside your organization. And so to try to mitigate this, we need to think about this as a data platform with the GPTs, something that should be deployed inside your organization, because this provides us a couple of benefits. First and foremost, it gives you that provenance over your data, right? You know exactly what information has been fed into that model at any given point in time. Additionally, this means that we can give it the most recent information, whether that's something that your organization provides or a vendor might provide as a service. We're able to control, again, the information that's being brought together and served up to these models. As a result, this also allows us to start being able to reference this by constraining the information that a model is being asked to either summarize, generate statements about, etc. The last thing that I think is important to call out here as well is that these GPTs also can become a particularly unique IP, not just generator, but an IP tool in and of itself. Utilizing a publicly available GPT often means that, you know, everybody has access to the same collection of information and the same collection of you know, the actual same tool that's being used to generate insights from that information. And at least in the US, which I think is the majority of the audience here today, that would probably fall under or would fall under the idea that anything that is generated by those models is considered non-obvious. I'm sorry, it would be considered obvious, excuse me. and so therefore may end up with some issues associated with it if it were applied for a patent. That said, flipping that idea on its head and bringing that model inside and having it be allowed to be trained on internal data would allow that non-obvious statement to be reapplied, because at that point, that is something that is unique to your organization and something that can then be utilized to generate unique insights that others may not have been able to generate on their own. So all of this is to say that AI is fundamentally, first and foremost, a tool. It is something that is not going to just swing in and take your job, because at this stage, AI requires human intervention, particularly in the sciences. So while AI may not take your job, somebody who's effectively using AI probably will. So that's why we need to think about it. To use that car analogy here, you can use Google Maps to come up with the perfect route to go from your home to your office, but you still need to get in the car and drive there. So that's the way that we should think about it. It is a tool to improve efficiencies and not just something that's going to replace human intervention in the workforce today. So I want to pivot here and start talking about some of the applications of AI now within the broader pharmaceutical organization. And so with that in mind, I do want to start off by talking about unstructured data and being able to draw insights from that content. So most analyses today, particularly when we're talking about big data or small data even as well, they rely on something that's called structured data. The easiest example of that would be like an Excel spreadsheet. It has a regular format to it, rows and columns, or it could be a specific data schema in the case of databases or JSON objects. There is a regular structure to that data, and that makes it very easy for a computer to be able to do something with it, right? I say go to column C and then go to cell 5 and do this thing to the value that is in there. It makes it very easy for a computer to do that. However, unstructured data is what humans like to use. There are pictures, there are paragraphs. Oftentimes it conveys and has, based off of the context, unspoken content and meaning and data and information that is locked in how that is set up. And as a result, the vast majority of enterprise data exists in this unstructured format, which makes it very difficult traditionally for computers to be able to do anything with that. If we think about this in the life science context, this could be PDFs, this could be conference proceedings, it could be posters, it could be presentations, it could be recordings of presentations. Any of that stuff is got valuable information in it, but it's just hard to be able to access it and analyze it. So our goal then, the job that I'm talking about, would be to extract this data, this information, and present it alongside structured content, or in some instances, utilize it as a way to explore through the information that might exist within your organization. So this idea, extractive QA, this is a model, a large language model. Type it as a job. When I say question QA, it stands for question answering. And so these models, basically what we're asking them to do is to read a document and then answer questions based on that document. So in this case, it could be what modalities are being mentioned, what's the mechanism of action that's being described in this paper. But in any instance, we're trying to ask the question, we're asking the model a question to be able to find that we believe exists somewhere in this document, right? This is a journal article. It could be up to 20, 30, maybe even 40 to 50 pages, depending on how it's set up and what it's covering. But there's still meaningful information in there. It's just that normally we'd have to have a person sit down and read through it and then be able to answer it. We're having the model do that job instead. And so we can render this in a couple of different ways, right? We can start to add structure to this by being able to maybe take structured content and then show that alongside this, these questions, to be able to add structure to this unstructured content. So in this particular case, we're rendering it in a spreadsheet format, right? Saying what is the treatment that's being studied for ulcerative colitis in this particular instance. And it's going through, at least in that fourth column, and being able to render out these, pull out these answers, which could then be maybe validated by a subject matter expert. But either way, It's actually doing the job of somebody reading these documents and then returning this in a format that could be then utilized for further visualization, for other types of maybe setting up other machine learning methodologies. At the end of the day, it's taking something that was previously unusable, or at least very, very difficult for a person to use, and being able to then turn it into something that a computer can use very, very effectively by turning it into a structured data form. Another way that we can do this is utilize these extractive QA models to go through and actually start to develop knowledge graphs, explore the relationships between concepts based off of questions. So in this particular case, we're asking what are the biomarkers associated with HDAC6 inhibition. We can start to see particular answers come out like HR23B, and we can start to see then by asking other questions, where does that show up? How does this all link together? How does this large space of unstructured data and all the hidden meanings, relationships, and content that exists within that begin to relate to each other, and then be able to render that in either a visual format like this, or be able to export it into, again, another structured data format that can then be used for further analysis within an organization. So when we also, another way that we can look at this is being able to do, at least within pharmaceutical discovery, doing property prediction. Now, when we talk about the decision-making process and discovery, as I mentioned before, it follows a funnel, right? We start with these fast and cheap approaches, things that allow us to cover a very large chemical space, and then we begin to whittle it down kind of in stages to get to more refined, more expensive types of experiments and assays to, again, identify the compounds of interest to be able to, again, affect a positive pharmaceutical response. This process, though, is often done in tiers, and we thus need to find and prioritize different compounds fairly quickly and do it in a way that allows us to make those decisions, again, quickly and efficiently. However, this has previously relied on incomplete data, as I mentioned before. There are gaps. It may mean that that compound in particular has not been tested yet. It may mean that it hasn't performed well enough, at least in the first couple collections of information, to maybe not be prioritized for more testing. It means that any of these instances may mean that there is a potential pharmaceutical candidate that is actually going to be deprioritized or potentially even thrown out of consideration altogether, simply because of the order that it was tested in. And so what we're trying to suggest instead is actually filling in some of these gaps by predicting how it may perform in other experiments. And this then allows us to say, okay, well, maybe this is actually something that would be worth studying further if we were to validate these further, these missing values. And so artificial intelligence in this particular case allows us to learn from the past, utilize previous experiments to inform how these particular compounds may perform in the future. And there are a couple ways we can do this. We can classify it to say, okay, this is like a yes/no question. Does this does this impact or lead to hepatotoxicity? Or we can actually calculate specific types of physicochemical properties, like lipophilicity in this particular case. And these are actually jobs that many types of machine learning methodologies are quite good at. And so we can use something like a SMILE string to actually then basically a text-based representation of a molecule to be able to make these predictions. And this is a bit of a phone book of a slide, but I think the thing that's important to call out here is that there is a wide range of different types of physicochemical toxicity, all types of actual properties that we can actually start to make assessments by. And again, fill in those gaps within existing data sets to better inform that decision-making process, which again, I think is particularly cool because we can do this at scale, right? We can do this against thousands or hundreds of thousands of chemical compounds without necessarily sending them to to do testing, and at least then allow us to get a better idea of the directions that we can go based off of that. Another area that's really cool about this too is being able to use graph convolutional neural networks. This is a newer type of deep learning model that actually allows us to account for the chemical structure. Effectively, as a graph might suggest, there are nodes and relationships between those nodes and properties within those nodes, which if you can think about it in a little bit of a different way, it allows us to actually render in a chemical compound into an actual graph, which can then be used, again, accounting for its structure and how it's interacting with the other atoms within its local, maybe local area, to be able to make more informed decisions or make more informed predictions based off of that. And this is utilizing a similar process to how we might actually look at recognizing things in pictures as an example. But all of this is to say that this there is a lot of different ways that we can apply newer types of AI models, or I guess in this case, deep learning models, to maybe unlock previously inaccessible properties or find new ways to apply that within the discovery process. But I think what's also important is to call out the fact that these models aren't static. Once we train a model, there may be inherent bias in it based off of the chemical compounds that have been fed into it to train it. And so to account for that, it's necessary to start off with baseline training, but actually fine-tuning that model over the life cycle of how that fits into the broader context of a particular research project or across a department, and basically utilize new data. So like I mentioned before, we get predicted values, but let's go and verify those values. And once we have that verification, let's feed it back into the models. That way it can continue to learn and grow and become more effective in being able to make these different types of predictions. Additionally, human feedback is another way in which we can do that by basically giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down, saying, yes, this was good, or no, this wasn't. By being able to do this retraining, we can specialize these models. Maybe it's for a very specific chemical space, or maybe it's for a very specific project. But this iterative approach allows us, again, to be able to take something that was maybe doing a pretty good baseline job and really turning it into a superstar tool to make these predictions for any given portion of that pharmaceutical R&D pipeline. But again, this allows us to more efficiently make those decisions and help make sure that there's nothing that's falling through the cracks by utilizing a relatively inexpensive process to fill those gaps within data. And the last thing I want to talk about today is focusing on where we can go with this idea and actually talk about de novo compound generation, actually suggesting new compounds for scientists to test within the lab. And one of the reasons for this is that there are, I guess, well, in this particular case, 10 to the 60th drug-like molecules that could theoretically exist according to Lipinski's rule of 5, which is a fairly common definition for determining if a drug or a particular molecule would be considered quote unquote drug-like. That has meant that because there's so many areas and so many potential avenues and chemical spaces that we could explore, that we haven't really ventured too far into the theoretical sea of structures that could be utilized to make potential medications. And there may be reasons for that. It may be based off of the drug targets. It may be based off of synthetic feasibility. But by being able to utilize basically a generative approach to kind of look just beyond the horizon, that may allow us to be able to iteratively move into new spaces that would, again, allow us to be able to suggest new routes for R&D. But it's a balancing act that we need to work on, right? It's not just about generating compounds. That's fairly easy to do, but we want to be able to generate compounds that are synthesizable and that are also potentially useful for a medicinal chemist to test in the lab. And when I say synthesizable, useful, any of these things, there is an inherent grammar to organic chemistry, right? Certain types of functional groups cannot be too close to each other, for example. They may react within the molecule. And so there's little rules, unspoken rules that we need to be able to work into these models to be able to handle that. And so again, I think this is where utilizing large language models, in this particular case, transformer-based models, can help out in this particular case, right? The ability for these types of models to recognize patterns within text is something that has made them incredibly useful for the actual space of doing, say, again, ChatGPT is a great example of that. And so being able to utilize this technology in a new way, which is to take an existing chain of text, which in this case would be a smile string, which again refers to a molecule, we can actually work on and utilize these same types of models that power things like ChatGPT to actually come up with new chemical compounds that might be useful for us to be able to test in the lab. So as I mentioned, you take these smile strings and feed them into these types of models and account for various things like synthetic feasibility, novelty, right? We don't want just to have a medicinal chemist come in and say, well, I could have thought of that, right? We want to have things that go, again, just beyond the horizon, and then be able to use these output smile strings, the generated stuff, right? We're viewing this as almost going to ChatGPT and saying, hey, can you give me 10 new molecules that I could try based off of this one that I'm giving to you now? We would take the output of that and then feed it into, say, predicted models, like I mentioned before, to get a general assessment of how this might work in the lab. And then from there, we can do further testing if it's something that merits following up on. But this allows us to create almost a flywheel of innovation, right? Where we're utilizing generated, completely de novo generated structures, being able to utilize and predict those structures' performance, going and testing those in the lab, and then taking the resulting experimental results and being able to feed that back into these models allows us to, again, come up with ways to not only fill gaps in data, but come up with a guided way to generate new data within an organization and how it works. So this is a way for us to quickly and effectively explore nearby drug-like compounds, potentially new areas of chemical space. But this, again, allows us to take on a wide range of new types of ways in which we can actually more effectively identify potential new drug candidates. And so for all of this, we basically want to look at where we can go from here, right? What are the different ways that we can take this? And so again, looking at expanding the different types of property prediction that we can do with GCNs may allow us to explore things like quantum mechanics, physical chemistry, other biophysics and physiology related basically properties that we can then try and mess with. But also by utilizing a blend of both public and internal data, we can actually use a pipeline by which these molecules are fed and actually get a general assessment of their performance before we even take anything to lab, utilizing previously used data. And then again, utilizing molecule optimization with transformers, being able to generate these compounds. But it's, again, about finding that balance between something that is both synthesizable, that is useful, that would actually seem to be a potentially viable drug candidate, and something that a medicinal chemist wouldn't come up with off the top of their head. So there's a lot of different ways that we can go forward here. But what I think all of this is meant to say is that AI can be a very, very powerful tool to both bring information together, but also generate new information that can then be used to inform that decision-making process within the discovery space. So all of this, again, is meant to fill those gaps in information, right? We want to be able to make sure that any scientist has both access to as much information as possible, but while maintaining that balance of ensuring that the right information is being surfaced at a given moment in time so that they can actually make an informed decision process. And this then frees up their time, right, to focus on other types of their work, the things that AI can't quite handle as well. And so again, by working together in this kind of back and forth, this tandem kind of tool set, it allows us to really improve the R&D productivity for these types of groups. Additionally, by being able to incorporate people into the loop as well as new data, We can continuously improve the performance of these models or refine them to specific tasks. And finally, our long-term vision then, particularly where I think we can take this, is to bring together the best of both worlds, right? To guide that decision-making process from end to end. We really want to make sure, again, that the right information is being surfaced at the right time, and that if we need to explore, we can provide ways to guide that exploration to make it progress as efficiently as possible. And so I'll pause here. I want to thank you all for the opportunity for taking the time today, and I'll pass it back over to the Astrix team for any questions that have come up during the presentation. And thank you so much for your time and attention.
That's great, Sean. Thank you very much. Fascinating presentation, of course. Great topics. A lot of stuff in there to really kind of make you think. So, for the folks who joined maybe right after we got started, you're welcome to ask questions. You would do so by typing them in on the question function there on the GoToWebinar panel.